Good afternoon, everyone. Me again. So, in this room, I'm taking off my OWASP vendor neutral hat and putting on my let me sell you some IriusRisk licenses hat. So today I'm going to be talking about IriusRisk, the world-class, world-leading automated threat modeling platform. Automated, we'll talk about that. Now, some of you saw the LinkedIn notification. So I've been with IriusRisk for about 2.5 months now. I am the Asia Pacific region's solution architect. So my primary role is pre-sales. So when, not if, but when your employer purchases IriusRisk, you'll be working with me as we go through your proof of value and work out how you're going to be customizing it, how you're going to use it, how you're going to roll it out. And then you'll be working with my colleague Willow on how it's going to be priced. And it looks like we're starting over. Oh. So we don't have a good pickup? Okay, fine. So when you decide to purchase, I'll be doing the tech assessment with you, helping you work out your specs, help you with customizations, onboarding. Willow will help you with the pricing and make sure that you pay the invoice. Thankfully, I don't have to worry about that. Well, I guess I do, because I do want my bonus, but hey. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about threat modeling in general. If you want to hear more about threat modeling, then come downstairs right after this for my thoughts on threat modeling, where I'll put the OWASP hat back on. And I'll try not to mention IriusRisk by name. We'll see. So I have just a couple of slides I wanted to go over before we look at the tool. Now, I gave it a really punchy title so that you'd come, but so part of one of the talks that I'm touring these days is talking about show me the threat model, the fact that we have threat modeling mandates coming our way. And so I pulled a couple of slides from that. It's a crime. It's a crime not to perform threat modeling. No, really, it is. In some jurisdictions, for some systems, and under certain conditions. Anybody who has not heard my talk before, have a guess about what jurisdiction it is in fact potentially a crime not to threat model? Anybody want to venture a guess? Europe? Yeah, with GDPR, Europe is often a first guess, but the fact of actually having it be a criminal offense and you could go to jail, not there. California? California, that'd be cool, wouldn't it? It is Singapore, yes. Cheating. So under the 2018 Cybersecurity Act, they established the Commissioner of Cybersecurity. And there are two specific powers the commissioner has. Well, three really. They can designate a system as a critical information infrastructure system, which makes the owner of the system a critical information infrastructure owner, a CIIO. They can establish a code of practice which has the force of law. And then they can order corrective actions. Okay. So that's the key piece. They can order corrective actions under the force of law. So one of the things that's mandated in the code of practice is you have to do an annual risk assessment in the prescribed form and manner. The prescribed form and manner says you will include risks derived from threat modeling. So under the force of law, the code of practice says you have to do the risk assessment, and the risk assessment must include threat modeling. So if you deliver a risk assessment report and it does not include the results of threat modeling, then the commissioner's office can say, hey, that's missing, do it. They issue a corrective order. If you then say, no, we're not doing it, then it's a criminal offense and you go to jail. So that is how it can be a crime not to threat model. So other countries haven't gone quite that far. Here in New Zealand, we have a relatively new document which CERT-NZ has signed on to on behalf of New Zealand government that recommends you use a tailored threat model during product development. Now, recommends is a pretty far cry from it is a criminal act not to do it. But this is important. So one of the things that I've been talking about in presentations, I'll be doing this talk probably, well, a version of this talk in Singapore in a couple of months, as well as in Australia, is just to realize that these mandates are on their way. The critical infrastructure awareness of governments is moving toward a threat modeling risk assessment mandate for critical systems. The definition of critical system varies. In Australia, it includes grocery store chains. In Singapore, it does not. So that's one of the things that varies, is whether or not you could be a critical infrastructure system. Sorry, telcos, you are. So that's the big variable, but ultimately if they say, oh, it's critical system, you have to be doing this, we've got to see the risk assessments, show us your threat model. So we're going to see that. In fact, I heard from another delegate here yesterday that the New Zealand government has started talking about eventually creating a Critical Infrastructure Act. 5 years? 4 years? Okay. But it's coming. Okay, so I wanted to talk about that. Now, the next thing is, I don't have a lot of time. I would normally go through, and in fact, downstairs next hour, I will go through, what is a threat model. Simply put, a threat model is a representation of a system, usually in the form of a data flow diagram, and then associated with the components of that system model are the threats to the components and the countermeasures or mitigations to those threats that you have selected to implement, as well as your risk acceptance memoranda or documentation for any threats that you have decided not to mitigate. So essentially, it's the collection of the things you've decided to do and not do, along with whatever assumptions and limitations you've placed on the model as you built it. And then it should normally have your testing methodology and your model validation methodology laid out. So that's a threat model. It's that whole collection of information. Well, how do you get there? You ask 7 simple questions. Now, as background, this is not original to me. I'm an academic. I will not claim credit for anything that's not me. It's Adam Shostak in 2014 published his 4 questions. What I've done is I've said, well, let's look at multiple parts to some of those questions, and now we have 7. So, first question is, what are we building? And your approach to answering that is typically, let's build a data flow diagram. And we'll annotate it with things like what information assets are moving around, what encryption is in place where, what authentication schemes are in place, is this HTTPS, is this HTTP, and so on. And then you ask the question, what can go wrong? And depending on the methodology and tooling you're using, the way you would answer that could be using Stride. It could also be using, say, built-in risk pattern libraries, such as those that come with the IriusRisk tool. Then the question is, what might we do about it? You identify
the countermeasures that you could implement in order to address the identified threats. The second part is to say, well, what will we do about it? So that's going from the whole candidate list of anything we might do to the ones we'll actually implement because they fit within our budget, say. Then, this is the important question. Now that we've decided what we will and will not do, you're going to leave some residual risks. These are the things that we have not fully reduced because of the countermeasures that we are leaving unimplemented. We've decided not to spend $200,000 on a super new next generation firewall or whatever it is. Okay, you decided not to do that. That means some risk has not been eliminated. Is the business owner good with your decision? If the answer is no, then go back to answering 3B. Choose additional or better countermeasures until the business owner answers yes. And sometimes as you're going through that process, you get to have the budget conversation because the business owner hopefully also has some sway with the budget owner. And if they insist we must do this additional thing, then they'll come up with the budget to pay for the additional thing. Because simply saying we're going to do it doesn't help if you don't have the money allocated to do it. Then part A of question 4 is, how do we know it works? What is our testing process for the selected countermeasures? Okay, when you say we're going to mitigate this threat by implementing this security feature, what is your test process for the security feature? Because if you don't test it, as far as I'm concerned, it's not there. And as far as your testers are concerned, and as far as your business owner is concerned, it's not there because you haven't verified it. So test plans, test cases, test procedures, those are important. And the last one is our model correct? We went through this whole modeling process, and very often you'll have a couple of security analysts helping you with the threat model while the developers are off making decisions. And very often, at the time you do the threat model, they're going to say, oh, we're going to use XYZ library. Then they start implementing using XYZ library and find out it's not actually compatible with the language platform they're using. So they switch to ABC library and don't tell you. So now your threat model is wrong. So this last step is saying, is the as modeled system actually what was built? So am I correctly representing the right thing? Are all of my assumptions still valid? Is everybody happy that the model represents the thing we're about to put to production? Now, but we're here to talk about the tool. So where does it come into play? IriusRisk automates 2 and 3A. Once you've built the diagram and you click the Update Threat Model button, it generates a list of threats and it generates a list of candidate countermeasures. In IriusRisk speak, they're recommended countermeasures. You then, the human decision maker, answer 3B by marking some of the countermeasures from recommended to required and recommending others from recommended to rejected or not applicable. And those, of course, there need to be risk acceptances associated with. So that's, you take the list of recommended countermeasures and decide what to do. Then, IriusRisk provides automation support for these last bits. It's not automated, it's automation support. As in, you can use the IriusRisk user interface to do those markings of what is and is not required, what is not applicable. You can capture risk acceptances and so on in the UI. You can also capture test case results. And the next question is, well, is it done? Not simply, so you notice 4A is how do we know it works, as in what are the test results? But before you even get to that, the question is, did we finish? Is that security feature implemented? And that's where we use workflow, backlog tool such as Jira, or heaven forbid, ServiceNow, interfaces so that you use your normal workflow management, your normal backlog management to track the completion of those implementations. And then you bring it back and say, okay, the ticket is closed, done. That means the countermeasure is implemented. And you get the green tick in IriusRisk. So the automation support is that round trip with your backlog management tool. Okay, I've used up enough of my time that I need to start the demo, which is good because, oh, I have one more slide I wanted to talk about. So benefits. The key thing about threat modeling in general is it slows you down at first. It's a new thing to do. Everyone has to learn it. You slow down so that in the long term, you move faster. You're taking a practice, you're shifting conversations left. Initially, you've got that speed hump to get over. And then you'll find that things pick up pace afterwards because you've addressed things and there's less rework. Everybody involved in doing the threat modeling has a better understanding of what the threats are, what the risks are, and why we're doing what we're doing. That is all in itself beneficial. It avoids rework, which can be a huge deal when you get something very wrong. It increases stakeholder confidence. Oh, and that particular slide I forgot to add in, and coming soon, because the government said so. So now it's demo time. This is where we need a mic stand. Okay, I'm going to switch to that. Okay, welcome to the IriusRisk user interface. IriusRisk is usually deployed as a SaaS platform. In particular, it's deployed as a single tenant AWS workflow. So we can deploy for Australia, New Zealand customers, AWS Sydney, just like everything else. This particular instance that I'm on is running in the Sydney region. Yeah, this is my Australia instance. I have another instance running in one of the EU regions. And we have here a roster of projects. So what I'm going to do is walk through looking at a couple of elements in a really simple use case in a very simple notional system, because that's about how much time we have. So I'm going to create a new project. And I'm going to give it a very informative name, like Demo 5. And I did not do this, so I'm not going to worry about answering these. Now, when I create the project, I get dropped into a blank drawing screen. If you look at this drawing screen, it may be familiar to you. It's draw.io. So if you're used to using draw.io, here you go. As part of enabling the analysis engine, every component in an IriusRisk threat model must reside inside a trust zone. So we'll start with those. I'm going to look at the super simple case. One use case, which is user clicks a submit button on a form. And what they are submitting are their profile settings for some notional user-facing application. So it has personal information, their name, their email address, maybe their phone number, the profile information they're uploading, as well as an image to represent their avatar. Could be a photo, could be some other graphic. So it means we have both a binary object and some record data to deal with. So I'm going to need a couple of trust zones. The first one that I will put out there is just an uncontrolled zone, the big bad internet, which is where the user's browser is going to be and the traffic will be coming from. And then from my perspective, I'm going to put some stuff in the partner zone because we're deploying a simple AWS workload. And here I am relearning how to use a Windows machine. Sorry for that. Now, in the uncontrolled zone, I'm just going to place a browser. So now that I've dropped that browser component inside the uncontrolled zone container, when I update the threat model, the analysis engine will go, oh, that's in the uncontrolled zone. That has no trust, and that factors into the risk ratings for the threats. Over in the partner zone, it has a higher level of trust because this is a trusted partner, and we're going to deploy some really basic AWS components there. So let's say I have a Lambda that's going to receive the upload. So I won't even worry about, at this point, managing like my API manager or any of that routing. We'll get to that at some future version. Data's coming in, it's going to be processed by a Lambda. The Lambda is going to put, yes, the image in an S3 bucket and the record data in an RDS instance. So now I have some components living in my partner zone. I have my backing data store, I have my processing element, and I have the source of my data. That's enough to start dragging some connections in. Oh, at least it's a laser mouse. It's a corded mouse. And wow. What is this, like the 90s? Okay. So I have my data flows. I have my components. Let me go ahead and tag a couple of things here. So I'm going to edit the link. Come on. There it is. The data. No, that's the data flow details. That's interesting. The pop-up menu renders differently than it does on the Mac browser. Okay. I'm going to tag this simply to show that it is an HTTPS submission. And I'm going to say that this contains customer data. So the asset being moved is the personal information of the customer. So I tag that onto the link. And you can see that those show up as visible tags here. I have the option to have them show all the time or show only when hovering. So I'm going to turn off the assets. And now if I hover, the asset is visible, otherwise it's not displayed. Because you can see that can get kind of busy pretty fast. Now, this entire time I've been drawing, you notice there haven't been update lags or anything. That's because IriusRisk does not try to update in real time. It's got you here, and as soon as you make a change to the diagram, this button appears. So after you've made your changes, edited data links, added all your tags and other attributes, click Update Threat Model. And hopefully the demo gods are good to me and we don't have a timeout or anything. Yep. I did not make a sufficient sacrifice to have that move quickly. So now, having done that, you see it says threat model is updated. Now I can take a look at the threats that were identified. I have 4 components, and look, I have 4 components worth of threat information. Now, I'm going to look at the S3 where you'll see that 3 threats were listed. Notice this tree orientation you have here. So that leftmost one that says Amazon Web Services, that is a use case. So within our library, you have a risk pattern. Inside the risk pattern, you can have a number of use cases. Under each use case, you can have threats. Then associated with each threat are weaknesses and then countermeasures to the weaknesses. So in this case, the Amazon Web Services use case, they've identified S3 buckets as having 3 threats of interest. And they're the classic ones you'd expect. S3 denial of service, intentional or accidental deletion of data, and unauthorized access. So we've got tampering, information disclosure, and denial of service listed as threats to look at. Now, if I look at that was interesting. Intentional or accidental deletion threat. There are 3 weaknesses listed. Misconfigured access policies, data being too easy to remove, and the lack of a recovery or backup mechanism. For now, I'm going to look only at this last weakness and the 2 recommended countermeasures. So notice at this point it says enable cross-region replication and configure S3 bucket versioning. So in order to address this weakness, it's been recommended that we implement 2 countermeasures. So the first one, if I double click on configure S3 bucket versioning, we have a lovely description that tells us basically run an S3 API command to turn bucket versioning on. Okay, sounds good. Well, this is something that I can just ask one of my colleagues to do because they have the access to do that. So I'm going to, within the UI, I'm going to mark this from recommended to required and save the countermeasure. And now you can see that my bar has gone from red to partly amber. So it's showing that I haven't addressed 3 of the 4 countermeasures at all, and 1 I've marked it as required. So I go back here, and my team member goes off, he runs the S3 API command to turn on versioning, and in this case, there's a manual test method. Run the S3 API with the get bucket versioning command, and make sure you get back a value of enabled. So we'll say that he did that. So it passed that extensive, exhaustive manual test. Okay. So we're going to go into the countermeasure and say, okay, we're done. It's now implemented. And I look down here, I see, okay, that countermeasure has been implemented. That's great. The threat itself, if I close this and look at my bar again, now is 1/4 green and still 3/4 red. Okay, the math works, that's good. Now let's consider something that's a little harder to do. Say, enabling cross-region replication. I look at that countermeasure and it says, hey, go to the S3 console and do all these things. And I look at that as the security analyst, and I say, well, okay, so for each bucket, I'm going to have to do this every time I deploy. No. I'm going to ask my infrastructure team to add these properties to our CloudFormation stack fragments so that every time we deploy, this particular bucket, in every instance of this stack, it will have cross-region replication enabled. So I turn this over to the infrastructure team and say, please set this up for me. And I would do that. I wonder how I would do that. Maybe I would create a ticket. Countermeasure has been uploaded to the issue tracker. And now I see that it's marked as required. But the issue ID hasn't updated. That's interesting. Oh boy. Because I was on the wrong screen. Go me. So there I have a link directly to the JIRA project, to which I have not yet logged in. Good job, John. Yeah. Twice. Because we're extra secure. Okay, I brought this on myself. So now that I've joined JIRA from a new device, I can see that that description for the remediation has been copied over into a JIRA ticket. At that point, as the person requesting it, I can add additional information, update the description, add some comments, all the usual stuff you would do with a JIRA ticket. As part of the integration setup, which I can show you very briefly in just a minute, you can decide what issue type is created, what specific fields get populated if you have any custom fields created for the issue type, and what status it starts out in. All the things that you can usually do when you say, I want to create a new issue. So that when you, in IriusRisk, say, I want to create an issue for this, it will go and create the issue in the appropriate initial state. In this case, it comes in as a to-do unassigned. So I will go through my usual workflow, and we'll pretend that time passes. So I work on the ticket, say, okay, I'm working on this one, so I'm going to change it to in progress. I go and I make all of the required changes. In this case, I'm changing the configuration. So work is complete, so I'll save that comment. I'll mark it to done. Now, in real life, time would pass, and whatever your definition of done criteria are, including second-party verification and pull request approvals and authorizing merges and so on, happens before the ticket is marked as done. So the key thing about that is that checking your definition of done criteria is not something that's done inside the tool. You do it in your normal workflow. And then when all of that has been satisfied, you mark the ticket done. And we pick that up in IriusRisk by syncing with the issue tracker. So again, mainly for performance reasons, we're not constantly polling all of the issue trackers. Now, issue tracker configuration can be global for your entire instance, Or more likely, you'll have a default setting that's global, and then each project will be associated with the corresponding JIRA project. Or, and this is fun, you can have multiple issue trackers. So one set of teams are using JIRA, and another set of teams is using ServiceNow. Fine, just connect to both of them. And then at the project level, you say which tracker is being used and what project within the tracker should this IriusRisk project's issues go to. So now, because the ticket was marked done, when I run the update, so I sync with the issue tracker, and then I have to refresh in order to see the ticket has been marked as done, therefore the countermeasure is implemented. So at this point, I can look in the interface and I see I've marked 2 countermeasures as required. They're both done. Here they are, they're marked green. That's wonderful. And I've looked at, let's see, we've answered question 2 by generating the threats. We've looked at question 3A by seeing what are recommended. I've made some of my decisions in 3B. I don't have time to do all of them, sorry. And then the work has gone off, and we've verified that it was done correctly. So we've taken care of step 4A as well for those countermeasures. Now, all of this has been done in the UI, and you can see that that was a little time-consuming, right? So if we're doing this for hundreds of threats and hundreds of countermeasures across dozens of projects, maybe not so much in the UI. So at a future talk, we can go over how to automate some of those things using the rules engine. The short version on the rules engine, it's D-rules based. So if you can write D-rules for it, then it can execute. In most cases, what you actually do is use a user interface to specify when this condition is satisfied, take this action. Such as, if the data flow is marked as HTTPS, mark these countermeasures as implemented. So by having that kind of automation in place, there are a number of countermeasures and threats that you don't have to manually look at, because you have said, if they're using HTTPS, we consider these implemented. If they're applying our standard hardening baseline, all of these countermeasures are implemented. So that can all be done in your customized automation, which is outside the scope of my 30-ish minutes here. The last question, 4B, how good a job are we doing? Well, as I said, you need to verify that the model that you generated looks like the real system. So one of the things we'd like to do is output the model as it currently exists. Ooh, 5 minutes left. No, that's not right. Okay, 2:20, you're right. Good, because I have to be in time for the other talk. Okay, so I've created the report. This is our current risk summary report as a PDF. I'm going to download it. As soon as it finishes downloading, I'm going to click it, and I'm glad they have a PDF reader because I forgot to check. There's my model diagram. So now I can look at it and I say, yeah, that's the right system. Okay, that's good. Now, how are we doing on our threats and countermeasures? We track 3 risk numbers, or risk levels. The inherent risk is based on the threats identified. Here's what the risk would be if you did not address anything. The current risk is how good a job have you done at reducing risk based on the countermeasures you have marked as implemented. And the projected risk is where will you be when everything marked as required is done. So really, the projected risk is the one you care about. And when you're making those decisions about what will we do, presumably you're trying to get that to a low so that the business owner doesn't freak out when they look at the report. So in this case, as I scroll through, I see here are all of the threats that were identified, the controls that were recommended, their current status, and where we are with risk right now. And so here the residual risk is where we are based on the current status of the countermeasure. Projected risk is where we will be once we implement it. And if I work my way down here, we will eventually find the S3 bucket. And you can see that we've got a couple marked as implemented. So this is your tracing tool. Now I did this in the PDF. You can also output it as a CSV file so that you can then turn it over to your Excel jockeys and have them work through the analysis, maybe create some cute charts and so on. We also have a lovely full-fledged analytics module, which is the topic of a completely separate talk, and possibly more than you could ever want to use, but it's there. And with that, I'm going to cease the demo so I can give you 7 minutes for questions. Chris.
When you're doing the analysis of the AWS environment, could you, I mean, you're starting from a design point of view where you're creating those resources, but if you've got infrastructure as code or you've actually deployed it, could you not just suck down the config and analyze it?
Sorry, walking away from the mic. I shouldn't do that. So could we just...
So that it, for instance, so that it can see the attributes on the S3 bucket.
Yes. So could we work from infrastructure as code? The short answer is, if you're using Terraform, you can directly import. Okay. If you're using other infrastructure as code, we have a really cool intermediate representation. IriusRisk has created an open source specification called the Open Threat Model Spec. So you can take anything, parse it, and produce an open threat model representation of it, and then import that thing. The key to getting those to do cool things for you is in the mappings. From whatever is in your input source needs to map to a component that's in the library. So that when you import it, IriusRisk says, oh, it's one of those. And then it picks up the risk patterns associated with the component. If there's no mapping, then it just comes in as a generic component, and you're working from scratch. The ultimate key is having the analysis engine recognize that the thing in your model is an instance of a particular component, because then it picks up all of the library information about it. Anna. The range of the current library? Well,
yeah, what covers, what type of applications and systems that covers that?
Just a few. So we have an extensive library set for AWS, for GCP, and for Azure. We have the one that's currently growing the fastest is actually pure functional. So if you're designing software before you've decided what the implementation looks like, you can start to use the functional components, where it says, I have a web service, I have an authentication service, and so on. You haven't implemented it as a particular type yet. That is growing every month. We have at least monthly releases with both library improvements and platform changes, and bug fixes, of course. So it's at least monthly, and it always has some new content added. You can see we've got Docker in here, there's some Kubernetes, there's a little bit of SAP, message broker services, microservice-specific stuff. When you look at, say, on-premise architecture, there's internal server. So you have Iron that you've put some stuff on. Now, each of these things is actually itself a container. So you can put stuff inside it, which is really nice. And then we have collapse and expand and so on. And I know I need to go, so let's see, one more question.
One other thing on the library is additionally you've got OT.
Yes. Yes. So Within the core libraries are some physical components. We also have extensive physical components around IEC 62443, which is a value-added add-on.
And can you add your own components into that?
Yes, you can always add your own components. You can base them on existing components. The next thing that I would talk about if I had time is how you would apply a standard across all components. Basically, the standard, when we say we apply a standard, we're saying these are necessary countermeasures in order to assert compliance with the standard. All right. Okay, 3 minutes. Anything else?
So I guess
Emmy?
this is a live project, right? So if you get updated the library and everything, or you can update your current project, so you have new.
Yes, so I have the project living in my instance. I can reopen the project and re-update the threat model after the libraries have updated, and it will pick up any changes to the threat libraries.
But you have to be careful with this, because if you do reporting and budgeting and suddenly your numbers change because you updated the library and you're reporting it afterwards, what's going on?
But you can have versioning or something.
And for that, we do have versioning. So you can lock a version of the model, which is associated with a version of the libraries. So the live model can update as content in the libraries changes, but the model that you pushed up the chain won't change. And then you can pick up those updates at, in next quarter's budget. All right, I thank you so much. It was great to have you all here. Buy IriusRisk.